Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Cyber Threat Alliance webinar. So the Cyber Threat Alliance is a nonprofit organization that brings cybersecurity companies together to share information and collaborate on common topics of interest to improve the cybersecurity of our global digital ecosystem. My name is Neil Jenkins, and I'm the Chief Analytic Officer at CTA. And today we'll be discussing the findings from a recent white paper from Dragos, who is a CTA member that focuses on providing cybersecurity solutions for industrial control systems and operational technology and critical infrastructure. In this white paper, Jake Baines, who is our guest today, discusses the landscape of publicly available ICS and OT exploits. So we're going to talk about those findings and how Dragos recommends that organizations patch vulnerabilities within the limits of their operational realities. So Jake, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Baines. I'm currently a principal at Dragos, where I get to hunt for new vulnerabilities and examine existing ones. I've been a vulnerability hunter for quite some time now, but I've also professionally worked on exploits and red team tools and IDS. I occasionally write things like this white paper that we're going to discuss, and I also do the occasional conference talk. You could have just seen me recently at DEF CON speaking about printer vulnerabilities. So that's about it about me.
Great, thanks, Jake. So we encourage our audience to ask any questions you may have during using the Q&A function during the Zoom, and we'll do our best to cover those questions as we go along. So why don't we get started? So Jake, vulnerabilities and exploits and networks are really nothing new, and obviously they're a major threat vector for criminals or nation state actors to gain access to a network. We're always telling network operators to patch their vulnerabilities so that they can close off access routes, but it's really not that simple in the IT and ICS space, is it?
It's really not simple. It's honestly not simple in the IT space. Tracking vulnerabilities and patches and patch windows, that's all like very resource intensive. And so nobody is able to patch everything 100%. There's just not staffing to do so. But all of those tasks are even more important and difficult in OT because parts of the network are in charge of running and monitoring actual physical processes that might have little or no downtime. And any extended downtime can have a real and significant financial impact on the company. And I think more importantly to a lot of these teams is that a patch really represents a possible configuration change in the network. And these things need to be thoroughly tested before deploying because a configuration change could negatively impact safety. And what I mean by safety is human safety. The industrial processes that these networks are in charge of, they can maim and kill if they get out of control. So any change to these systems has to be taken very seriously. The other thing is that OT networks can be really uniquely designed. And I was actually doing some vulnerability research on some Moxa access points recently. And one of the case studies for these access points was using them as part of an oil pipeline monitoring system. And these access points were placed 16 miles apart on the pipeline. They spoke to each other via a long-range radio. And the pipeline stretched over some pretty remote territory. A failed patch to any of those systems, a failed upgrade, that's super challenging. And that's usually not the type of problem that IT network will run into.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, we talk about reasons why IT network operators don't patch. OT networks have those same issues, except now we're talking about complete stoppage of operations or at the worst, impacting human safety, health and safety. What do patching cycles look like in OT networks? Do they, how do they handle these cycles and make time to do that in light of these operational concerns?
So a lot of patch cycles are dictated and driven by regulatory requirements. One of the great examples is NERC-CIP, which applies to bulk electric supply companies. And that largely dictates patch cycles for high impact systems. So there's a lot of documentation involved and requirements dictate the monitoring for new patches must occur at least once every 35 days. And then applicable patches or mitigations must be applied within another 35 days. Again, all with a lot of documentation. But of course, like I said, mitigations can be put in place instead of actual patches. And there are ways to extend the deadline with mitigation plans and such.
Great, thanks. So why don't you talk a little bit about how Dragos defines public exploits of ICS and OT systems?
Sure. It is surprisingly a little complicated. We have to break that down into three parts. The first part is what is an exploit? And as this slide says, we consider an exploit to be anything that allows an attacker to bypass a security boundary. And that could be a curl command, it could be a URI that you copy into your browser. It could be a well-written description. Really anything that allows a semi-competent attacker to exploit a vulnerability falls within our definition of exploit. The next part we have to tackle is public. We only consider an exploit public if anyone can access it. Exploits passed around by private groups or exploits only in commercial exploitation frameworks, they're not really public by our definition. Stuff like exploit DB, Metasploit, public blogs, GitHub, that's all public content. The final part, of course, is defining what is ICS OT related. Obviously, exploits that affect ICS OT networks fall within that group. Stuff that targets PLC, HMI, safety systems, that's obviously OT related. But there are a lot of less obvious systems that we include in our data set. For example, we track a subset of VPN exploits because some operators use VPNs to access their OT networks. Or we track some Windows exploits. A lot of HMI run on Windows. So it'd be really silly of us not to count things like Eternal Blue in our data set.
So, I think that makes a lot of sense depending on the connectivity and the systems that are in use. What's the sense of scale here that you're tracking? Do those related exploits and VPNs and Windows start to outnumber kind of the clear ICS and OT exploits that you're tracking?
That's actually a really great question. Part of my job at Dragos is to help maintain a database of vulnerabilities that affect ICS OT networks. And that's where actually all the statistics for this paper came from. Anyways, we do our best to focus our content specifically on ICS vulnerabilities, meaning the vast majority of Windows vulnerabilities don't make it into our data set. We generally only try to include Windows vulnerabilities if they're obviously impactful. Stuff like Eternal Blue, Print Nightmare, there was a nice ping of death vulnerability that Microsoft patched last year. We do pull all those in, but we push away a significant amount of Microsoft vulnerabilities. Similarly, like on the VPN front, there are a lot of VPN issues, but we try to only include VPNs we know our customers are using or that we've seen activity groups that we're tracking are known to exploit. So both of those kind of cut down on these non-ICS specific type of vulnerability. Now, obviously, that's a judgment call on our part, but we find it ensures that the vast majority of things that we're tracking relate specifically to OT networks and not IT networks. And really, at the end of the day, it's just about 4% of the vulnerable exploits that we're tracking are Microsoft specific. So it's really not that high at the end of the day.
Interesting. And so can you also talk a little bit about how the vulnerability disclosure and management process is similar or different in the OT networks than it is in IT systems? I mean, in terms of IT systems, I think most people have a pretty good feel for how the vulnerability management process goes. You submit it to a vendor. Hopefully the vendor is going to patch, then maybe the researcher releases the exploit once the patch has been released, that kind of thing. Is that similar in the OT space?
It is actually very similar. Like I said, I've been doing vulnerability research stuff for quite some time now. And so I've had the experience on both the enterprise side and now the ICS side. And it's really a mixed bag on both sides. So it's basically what you would expect. Generally speaking, you ship everything to the vendor, you get your response. and they all have their different turnaround times for patches, whether that works with your disclosure timeline or not. I have found that some ICS vendors have significantly longer patch release cycles. There was a vendor I contacted in January of this year, and they hoped to have patches out by December of this year, hopefully. So that's significantly longer than I would give an IT company. I generally give them 90 days to get out patches. And that is largely represented in the exploit data set too. Typically, you do see these exploit writers releasing exploits after patches have been released. There are definitely cases where there's a big time gap before where an exploit was released, and then there's one that's 1,000 days later, a company finally released an advisory. That's just generally not the case.
Okay, great, thanks. So you noted that you've been keeping up with these database of these public exploits. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the trend in that over time?
Sure. You see if I can switch slides. I did it. So the overtime is pretty interesting in my opinion, because you would expect a curve rising left to right, generally to match the increased CVE we've been seeing year over year. But that isn't really quite the case. First, there's this interesting little blip in 2011 that exceeds all values until 2017. And this is basically the effort of a single individual publishing a whole bunch of proof of concept exploits for their research. And it sort of goes to show how few ICS specific vulnerabilities and exploits there are out there, because this one person just dominated the scene for many years. But beyond that, we do have an upward curve that seems to peak at 2019. Both 2020 and 2021 are sort of down years. Now, this particular graph was actually made in April, so it's a little bit out of date, but it still remains true that 2021 appears to be trailing 2020. So yeah, it appears to be a downward trend we're in right now. I have my own opinions why that might be, but not exactly clear why we're seeing PU exploits.
Okay, interesting. I mean, obviously from my perspective, I would wonder if, because of the nature of the things that you're working on, do you need to be doing vulnerability research on OT systems in OT environments? And if so, like if people were at home during the pandemic, was that preventing that kind of research from happening in 2020?
So it's actually really kind of funny that you'd suggest that. So this little downturn was actually a big point of contention during the review process of my paper. The original thing I did write was a real flip in, COVID ruins everything, even exploit development. But that didn't really track with me after a few edits. I have been doing vulnerability research remotely for many years. And really the fact of the matter that in the worst of times of COVID, we had more time to conduct research. Maybe it is more difficult to get your hands on a PLC. You certainly are not going into a whole lot of OT-only labs right now. But at the same time, there is a ton of IC/OT specific software out there that is easy to get your hands on, free to download type thing, and they're just riddled with errors. So I sort of rejected that out of hand. In my paper, I actually tracked this drop to published exploits being the drop of published exploits with the increase of ZDI buying ICS vulnerabilities. For people that don't know ZDI, it's the zero-day initiative. They purchase vulnerabilities and get them patched. But one thing about selling your discoveries to ZDI is you're supposed to lose your publishing rights to them. So very few ZDI purchased ICS vulnerabilities seem to have public exploits over the last few years. That's just a theory I have, and I can tell you during the review process, it was a very unpopular theory, but it was the only one we came up with that had any type of supporting data. So you can take it with a grain of salt.
Interesting.
Yeah. So unless you have anything else you want to talk about this one, I can slide right into talking about the Purdue model.
Let's do it.
Here we are. So the Purdue model is essentially an ideal network segmentation for ICS networks. Obviously, the real world is typically not ideal, but the Purdue model is something to strive for, as it nicely breaks down specific functionality within the OT network. And because of that, it's actually pretty easy to understand. At the top level, level 5, you have your internet-facing systems in IT land, web servers, email servers, the normal stuff you'd have facing the internet. And the model tracks all the way down to level 0 to the actual devices affecting and monitoring the industrial process. The real OT specific levels are 3 through 0. And I know this graphic shows level 3 part of IT, but that's not really correct. Level 3 generally manages the industrial operation, so it is distinctly OT. Level 2 is where your HMI and SCADA systems live. Level 1, PLCs and safety instrumentation. And like I said, level 0 is the physical process.
Great, thanks. This is really helpful. So I guess the kind of air gap that we talk about wanting to see with ICS systems, that would be that level 3.5, the DMZ there, is that right?
Right, sort of. Air gap is kind of a loaded word. The reality is not all ICS networks are like truly air gaps, but 3.5 is where all connections are expected to terminate, meaning there should be no direct connections from anything in OT up to level 4 IT and vice versa. So level 3.5 will generally provide like jump boxes or VPNs or some such control to access the OT network from the IT network. But is not always like a true air gap.
Yes, never is it? Great. So what's the distribution of exploits that you typically track across these levels?
Sure. So this slide maps exploits to the affected Purdue level. Now it's important to note that a single exploit could affect multiple levels. So we have some double counting here. A good example is Eternal Blue, which could be mapped to level 5, 4, 3.5, 3, and 2. But what I find particularly interesting about this slide is that the majority of exploits affect level 2 and level 3 systems. And that's neat for 2 reasons. The first is that level 3 is the entrance into the OT network. So let's say an attacker has breached a jump box in 3.5. They need to exploit a level 3 system in order to move into the OT network. So we're tracking more than 200 of those exploits. The other thing is that level 2 and 3 typically have control over level 1 and level 0 systems. So an attacker need not necessarily exploit these lower levels because level 2 and level 3 systems exist to manipulate them in the first place. So for example, if I take control of a level 2 HMI, then I can often just change the lower level system's operational parameters. A recent real world example of this is the Oldsmar water system attack, in which an attacker altered the amount of sodium hydroxide that the water treatment system was supposed to have. And I think this visually indicates that relationship really well. Why exploit the PLC when I can exploit the thing that controls the PLC?
That's really interesting. Yeah, why don't you go ahead on into the next slide?
Sure. Yeah, so like I was saying, we have impacts per Purdue level, but of course not all of the exploits are made the same. They all have different impacts. So they have different requirements. So we mapped the exploit impact to Purdue level as well. And this graph is a bit messy, but you can see a majority of the published exploits are remote code execution. And that generally makes sense to me because vulnerability hunters like myself, that's generally what we're going for anytime we're hunting for stuff. But you can also see there are plenty of other vulnerability types represented here. There's things like hard-coded credentials, data decryption, privilege escalation, etc. They're all represented in our data set, but that doesn't really make them worthwhile necessarily. And really the same can be said for the remote code execution exploits, really. Context matters a whole lot when you're attacking an ICS network.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, right? Like if I'm understanding you correctly, we talk about remote code execution vulnerabilities being bad, right? We generally push organizations to patch those quickly. And on top of that, it seems that there are a lot of RCE exploits at important points in the Purdue model or in the Purdue levels. But I guess what you're saying is that operators may not need to prioritize patching them as quickly because it should be harder for adversaries to exploit those environments. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. Everything has context. So if a network is properly segmented, how worried should I be about RCE in a PLC? Typically, to even reach that device, the attacker would need to go through a level 2 system anyways, and that system generally controls the PLC. So why am I worried about patching this low-level system? Really, you need to keep the attackers off of your level 3 and level 2 systems before you start worrying too much about what's going on that far down in the Purdue levels.
That's great. So, and we'll get to this, but that really helps organizations understand patching priorities, what matters, what doesn't matter, and it helps them take a real risk management approach to this problem, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Great. So what are some other trends that you've seen related to these public exploits?
Yeah, so one of the things the white paper really does is it really riffs on the idea of a exploit being useless. And I'm just going to continue down that road a little bit. I think any exploit that relies on a vulnerability with access control of medium or higher is fairly useless in an OT network. So let me define access complexity for you. It's actually a component of CVSS, which is MITRE's common vulnerability scoring system. Every published CVE is assigned a CVSS score by NIST. But just to be clear, for this discussion, I'm only talking about CVSS v2, mostly for historical reasons, because we went so back far in time to look at exploits. Either way, to quote the version 2 specification, AC measures the complexity of the attack required to exploit the vulnerability once an attacker has gained access to the target system. And there are 3 levels of rating here. There's a low, medium, and high, where low is basically exploitation at will. Medium covers attacks like that require social engineering and uncommon configurations. And high covers more complicated attacks like man-in-the-middle attacks. So like I was saying, I think a lot of medium AC exploits are useless in an OT network. For example, cross-site scripting, an attack that allows the attacker to run JavaScript in the victim's browser, is AC medium because it requires user interaction. A cross-site scripting attack generally needs to pull in external JavaScript and exfiltrate results to the attacker. But since connections are supposed to terminate at Purdue 3.5, the attacker will already need a presence within the ICS network anyways, making access to a victim browser far less valuable. Furthermore, many of the vulnerable web interfaces on these low-level systems generally aren't even used in the first place. So getting user interaction with an unused system is unlikely. Not to mention, you'll need an actual way for the victim to interact with the exploit link or whatever. That's the social engineering aspect, which is going to require some really creative thinking, because stuff like email is not generally present in OT systems. Similarly, a lot of high AC exploits that require man-in-the-middle are useless, in my opinion. Not specifically being man-in-the-middle is not specifically useless. In fact, the opposite is true. Being a man-in-the-middle is actually extremely powerful in an OT network, typically because many ICS protocols have no concept of encryption. So the attacker can alter communications between different Purdue levels to affect the changes they want. So you really don't need much else when you're a man in the middle in an OT network. But either way, the example I used in the paper is the bad EC params exploit. And that is, of course, based on a certificate validation issued that was disclosed by the NSA and Microsoft. The bad EC params allows the man in the middle to masquerade as a different entity, and that would look cryptographically sound to a victim Windows box. And I think the example screenshot I had in the paper was a rickroll on NSA.gov, which is a really kind of a funny exploit, really powerful, but it just doesn't have a value within a network that doesn't care about SSL or properly signed certificates in the first place. Yeah, so more or less, this table flags the number of exploits that we tracked that are AC medium or high, with the idea that defenders can easily deprioritize almost a third of all of these public exploits that have been published.
Great, thanks. And I have to say, I love the idea of these useless exploits. I mean, it really helps, I think, organizations understand what should be patched and what shouldn't. So what kind of scale of public exploit do you see happening in the wild?
So one of the big challenges in ICS right now is the lack of visibility into attacks at level 3 and below. It's easy to see exploits flung over the internet, but there are all sorts of papers about what's going on in level 4 enterprise. But below that, rarely is it talked about, and rarely is it published what's going on in level 3 through 0. Just monitoring within those networks is not where we want it to be. But you can see that the exploits that we do know have been used, they really align with what I've been saying. Level 3 and level 2 control lead the way. They have most everything an attacker is going to want. They can control the lower processes from these higher levels. So expanding beyond those positions is not necessary. And I'd also note that this graph just represents 10% of the exploits we're tracking. Just to reiterate, only 10% of all the exploits that we track are used in the wild, meaning truly a vast majority of them are unused and useless.
That's really fascinating. So who exactly is pushing out public exploits these days, and how does that help operators decide how to prioritize patching?
So a lot of public exploits are developed by professional security researchers employed by private companies, and they're pushing those things out as part of their day job. And that's useful to know, in my opinion, because you can easily monitor their public feeds. Companies like Talos and Tenable, they both have very easy to navigate vulnerability disclosure pages that often link to their exploits. So, for example, to continue with Moxa, Talos has published multiple proof of concept exploits against Moxa. If you see them post a Moxa vulnerability, you know there's going to be an associated exploit. So you can bump up the priority of those vulnerabilities a little bit. Similarly, like Metasploit has a good number of ICS vulnerabilities over the years. And Metasploit obviously comes with a fully weaponized system behind it. So it's important to track those publications if you're able to. And a great example of some ICS vulnerabilities that Metasploit published were a bunch of Yokogawa DCS exploits. And those systems are prevalent in a variety of OT industries, but they don't often see any type of public exploit written. But if you're tracking Metasploit, when those were published, you'd have really good warning that a fully weaponized exploit exists for this really important system within your network. So that's really good knowledge to have.
Yeah, that's great. So why don't you, I think this has been a really great discussion. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So why don't you summarize your findings for our viewers?
Sure. So there's a few bullet points. Basically, when a vulnerability has a public exploit, that should increase its priority because it makes it easier for literally anyone to attack that issue. However, it's important to consider the type of exploit that is being published and how it actually impacts the ICS OT network. Some types of vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting or vulnerabilities of requirement in the middle can probably be deprioritized. If you're on the fence about patching an issue, we have seen that a public exploit generally comes out within the first 30 days. So if you're beyond that 30-day mark and there's no public exploit, then maybe you don't actually have to patch the issue. Finally, data suggests that level 1 and level 2 exploits aren't really used in the wild. You can likely deprioritize a lot of those vulnerabilities. But you should keep in mind, we still don't have great visibility into OT attacks. So don't ignore the most impactful exploits at those levels.
Great. Well, thank you. As I mentioned, that's all the time we have for today. We really appreciate everyone for watching the webinar. And of course, a special thanks to Jake and Dragos for sharing this research with us. If you're interested in taking a look at the white paper, it is available on Dragos's blog. So just head over there and you'll be able to find it and download it. If you asked a question in our chat, we'll do our best to get back to you with an answer via email. And finally, if you're interested in joining the Cyber Threat Alliance, I encourage you to go to cyberthreatalliance.org/membership and click the Join CTA Today button, and that'll help you get in touch with our membership team. So thanks again for joining. We appreciate you being with us, and stay safe out there, everybody. Thanks. Bye.